Alright class, go ahead and get in your signed groups for your final project. Don't forget to introduce yourselves, say your name, your pronoun, and a fun fact about yourselves.
Hi, my name's Katie. I use she, her pronouns, and fun fact is I'm ace.
Hi, I'm Nyah. I go by any pronouns, and I guess fun fact would be that I'm bi.
So, my name's Eldred. I use he, they pronouns, and I guess, I'm trans and gay.
Hi, I'm Em. I use any pronouns, and a fun fact about me is I am AAA, asexual, aromantic, and agender.
Hi everyone, I'm Mila. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm trying to think of a fun fact. Oh, I'm a lesbian.
Oh,
Wait.
Wait.
Are we all queer?
Welcome back to our first episode of this podcast. Today I wanted to talk about asexuality in mainstream media and its representation. One of the first forms of representation I've personally seen is in BoJack Horseman with Todd Chavez. But something that's interesting about that is all the representation that I have seen has been kind of the same stereotype, like, mold of asexuality, where someone is, like, completely opposed to sex, doesn't want to talk about it.
And also, another interesting thing I see with Ace Rep, Todd Chavez was one of the first characters I've seen, and what's also interesting about him is that it's, like, shown throughout that, like, why is he kind of adverse to some things in, like, relationships? Another trend with, like, Todd being the first real rep, a lot of Ace Rep before that has been rep in quotations, where it's kind of fandom, like, colloquial
And
rep.
just for the people who don't know, who is Todd Chavez?
Oh, yeah. So, BoJack Horseman is a show on Netflix. It is very good, very sad. Todd is a character who was at first kind of like the butt of the jokes, and over time he started developing and really like falling into his own. And him being Ace was like a very important part of his like character development.
So I'm just like curious you said that they like actually spend time developing him being Ace, and it's not just like thrown in, or it's not like bad reps. So I don't know how many seasons there are in BoJack, so how long was that going on for?
Yeah, so there's 6 seasons in BoJack Horseman. I'm pretty sure in the 3rd season is when they do the big reveal, and he's having a conversation with his partner. But at the beginning, at least, I think it wasn't like the 4th season until he kind of owned the term asexual. A lot of the plot point between him and his partner in the 3rd season was that he didn't like labels, and so he didn't want to label their relationship. He didn't want to label himself. But the way it was seen was kind of as like a non-committal negative, because that's how his partner made it out to be. And it wasn't until season 4 when he actually started being like, I guess I'm ace, but he was kind of almost forced into accepting that. And I think the show did that intentionally, but it's still like, that's one of the first forms of like public representation that ace people have gotten, is someone being forced to admit that they're asexual.
Yeah, unfortunately, personally, I can't even think really of like other rep in media for Ace people, and I think it's pretty cool to hear that it took like 4 seasons for them to flesh it out. But it does suck that you said it's forced.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the like ace rep is not designed to be ace rep. Like, a lot of the times it's a character that you could read it as just person that doesn't get into the romantic relationships in the show or media. So like there are a lot of characters that like are kind of claimed by the asexual community, but people outside of that community wouldn't even know.
Kind of like headcanons then. Yeah.
Also, I think that this is really interesting with the fact that there's not a lot of representation, and all the representation is very one-dimensional. There's been some, not major, but just like minor issues within the queer community about accepting asexuality as like a valid member of the alphabet mafia, so to speak, which I think is ridiculous. Like, it's the whole point of the queer community is a space for people to be safe to like be who they actually are and be able to talk about that without feeling judged or like they're abnormal or like there's anything wrong with them. And asexuality definitely fits into that. A lot of times in shows too, it's treated as like a medical issue that can be fixed, very similar to being gay and conversion therapy and things like that. So I think there's a lot of similarities, and it's unfortunate that ace people can also get backlash from their own community.
All right. Who here can name or can think of a character from a show or a movie whose, I'm not going to say personality doesn't base around the fact that they're queer, but where the show doesn't focus on the fact that they're queer? Yeah.
In Umbrella Academy, there's quite a few instances, but mainly in season 2 where Elliot Page's character kisses a woman and their character at the time is female presenting. So it's just unmentioned, not really focused on. It's just treated as an affair and not as gay.
Okay, that's a good one. I mean, also the fact that I've not seen the show, but Elliot Page obviously transitions later on in the show, and they kind of let that be in there naturally.
Yeah, and I think that's a very like, I don't know, it's a very like unique case because like Elliot Page transitioned during like between the seasons, so for them they couldn't just randomly make the character like the opposite gender or like just like make them transfer, it's
get a whole new actor.
Yeah, it would have broken the continuity of the show. So in that scenario, while yes, Elliot Page's character does have like this whole like arc of him transitioning, it doesn't feel like that's what the show is totally about, or like even that's what the season is totally about.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of, I feel like those kind of instances of queer representation are just as important as the ones where the media is focused on the fact that people are queer, or maybe it's focused on the fact that people are queer, but it's woven into the story, kind of like Bottoms, where there's a lot of queer people in Bottoms, and there is, an arc with the main character, and having a love interest, but it's a comedy over everything. Or even just, I was thinking of movies like Paranorman with, Mitch randomly just in a single sentence of dialogue saying that he has a boyfriend at the end of the movie.
Speaking of Paranorman, that the director of that movie, Chris Butler, he also directed the movie after that, which was The Box Trolls. And what's really interesting is that he intended both movies to be a queer allegory. And like at the time when I believe Paranorman came out in 2011, at the time a lot of like Republicans were getting all hissy and all upset, and they wanted to make sure they included Mitch's throwaway, like, offhand, "You're gonna love my boyfriend. He loves chick flicks." They threw that in to piss off Republicans, and I just wanted to add that because that's a fun fact and also funny.
No, as they should. I think that's also weird how people, get upset about that kind of stuff. That makes me think about, like Gravity Falls. You want to
Yeah, specifically from Gravity Falls, the two cops in that show, and I think the person that made the show actually intended them to be queer, but of course the people censored it because they couldn't have that. But yeah, no, they just have like a really like tight bond, and of course queer people caught on to that. Yeah, no, it was confirmed that they are queer.
Yeah, Alex Hirsch was highly, highly censored by Disney because, of course, it's Disney. Had to appeal to that audience, I guess. And so it is heavily implied their relationship shows that even their names, Blubs and Darlin, sounds like love and darling. It's so obvious. And there's other instances where, they wanted to insert queer people into the show, but he just couldn't. So I think those little, I guess, tiny moments are what's good. Even just like Nickelodeon's show, The Loud House, Clyde's dads, you know, he has two dads. That's not huge, and it's not made out to be a huge thing because it's normal. And I think it's important that we have those shown in the media we consume because people don't see it as normal. They see it as abnormal.
And also, like, on the topic of, like, having things be seen as normal, Steven Universe was also a really big one because it was already, like, a big deal that the character Garnet, if, for people that don't know, there are gems in that show, and gems can fuse to create new things, and the character Garnet is a fusion of two gems, Sapphire and Ruby, who are both supposed to be kind of, like, women, and like in the show, it was already a big deal for that to kind of like Garnet to be a metaphor for like a like lesbian relationship. And it was even an even bigger deal later in the show when those two characters got like canonically married and there was like an on-screen kiss. And that was also like a very big deal in like a kids show, making this stuff just like normal. This is life. It happens. It's not like crazy or anything. So, I guess, what have you guys been, like, listening to recently, like, music?
Kind of all over the place, but I've been listening to, like, Glass Animals recently.
Nothing gay that I know of, just my favorite Australian metalcore band, Thornhill.
Depeche Mode, which I could definitely argue is pretty gay.
I've been listening to this one guy named Tom Cardy, and he's not gay, but he freaking acts like it, man.
Like Prince.
Yeah. So I listen to a lot of Will Wood, and I've been getting back into Tally Hall recently. And in the case of Tally Hall, and also Will Wood, there's a lot of like queer kids, teenagers, a lot of teenagers that are like on the younger side from like 14 to like 15ish, even as young as like 13. And I feel like there's two parts of this kind of like phenomenon, and it's the younger queer kids don't have a community, like an actual like in-person community, so they kind of band together over music. But another interesting thing, a lot of these musicians are straight. Like all 5 members of Tally Hall, I think 2 of them are married and have like kids. Will Wood himself has like an interesting like history of like he's pan, but he doesn't know if he is, and also kind of being told that he was gender fluid and then realizing, oh, no, I just like dressing femininely, and you guys are like telling me something that I'm not.
That kind of makes me think of, you know, just kind of like alternative genres of music and how they tend to have like a big, I guess like queer following. I guess like, you know, like The Cure, like like Bauhaus or like Susie and the Banshees. Like I know for a fact that like a lot of gothic people or even emos, like think about the amount of people who are into MCR, you know.
21 Pilots, Mother.
Yeah. Yeah. 21 Pilots, Mother. It's this alternative cultures, kind of alternative or just like rock music. Kind of what I was saying earlier, people find community with like the freaks and weirdos. And oftentimes because queer people do kind of fall into that outcast category, like social category, that's where they find kind of like community in all just like old-fashioned spaces and stuff like that.
True, and then once there's like a moderately sized queer following, then people talking about the artist can also find other people to talk about like their experience being queer with, and then that can just kind of build. So it's a great place for younger queer people to find community.
Yeah. And, you know, kind of like what you were saying about, you know, the freaks and the weirdos, you know, alternative music is called that way for a reason. It's subgenres. So, you know, subcultures have their own separate culture that is separate from, you know, the dominant culture. And if the dominant culture is straight, and if the dominant culture is, you know, cis heteronormative, then, by default, you're going to find that a lot of people within those subcultures are going to not fit within cis heteronormative, society.
Exactly. Like, if there's a bunch of straight people listening to, like, Taylor Swift, for example, there are a good amount of queer people that listen to Taylor Swift, but, like, if it's mainly, like, straight people, then some queer people might just be put off by that and want to find community somewhere else, because if they go to a concert, it's not going to be somewhere where they can maybe relate to the people there, at least.
Gay enough.
Yeah, I mean, also, but on the flip side, there are, like, really popular obviously straight artists that queer people have kind of taken over. Like, I don't know. I recently saw Weezer in concert. Oh my God, and that band is so... It's 4 straight white dudes, but it's like... And the music isn't even, like, not a hint of queerness.
No,
but queer people have kind of, like, come into that space and, like, are, I don't know. It's,
Maybe
yeah.
came out of it, too.
Yeah. Exactly, I don't know.
Just call it the queer takeover, I guess, of music.
Queezer.
Queezer? Sounds like queef.
Hey, maybe that's why.
No, yeah, good on queer youth and fandoms for finding each other in these straight worlds.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to talk about was queer fandom spaces. For me, coming into the, like, internet age and Tumblr, Pinterest was a big one for me. Yes. Fandoms, like, specifically I wanted to talk about Voltron was a big one for me as a teenager. And I think that is a very interesting, like, perspective, because specifically for Voltron, it was really the media itself is not queer at all, really. Like, except at the end when they really actually pandered to the fandom. And it created, like, it was all these fans that saw these two characters that had a really good dynamic, and so they created this ship of them. And even though, and it was a mixture of the fans wanting it, and
they also had to have, like, some kind of proof for it, like they thought that it existed based on...
Yeah, exactly, because the more the fans shipped it, the more the creators and the producers and the animators kind of lent into it, which is why Voltron is such, like, a talked about thing. Like, there were so many like, drawings done by the animators of, like, Clance, like, kissing and, like, being gay, that it, like, fed into the fandom.
They were the biggest shippers.
Yeah. No, literally. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That just reminded me of Interview with the Vampire, because it's very similar, and apparently Anne Rice, the author, originally didn't intend for Louis and Lestat, the two main vampires, to be gay, but they have this interesting dynamic with each other where they hate each other and they love each other, even in the books. And so, of course, the queer audience that loved Interview with the Vampire and the whole Vampire Chronicles ended up just, pushing for it. So finally, once the movie was made, and of course they, Hollywood, they could not make that gay.
Hollywood.
They could not make that gay. But then...
Not with Brad Pitt.
Yeah, not with Brad Pitt.
But
no.
it's crazy because vampires are extremely gay in general, just as
Yes.
that was it. Go back.
And so then, once the show was made, Anne Rice is sadly dead, but I think she would approve. They made them in this, like, crazy gay relationship.
Yeah. As far as, like, fandom space, I think about, we already kind of mentioned it earlier, but, Gravity Falls, specifically with, this like inability of creating gay characters. So, the most obvious one being, the two cops, Blubs and Darland, who were made to be a couple, and fans could tell they're a couple, even if they can't explicitly say it, even if Disney is restrictive in some way, shape, or form, And that also kind of goes to the biggest ships in the fandom being, male ships. It's Stanford and Fiddleford. It's Stanley and Fiddleford. It's Bill Cipher, the demon, and Stanford, which was like confirmed a thing in the recent book. Like, it seems like these things in like also an older fandom kind of gets revived and brought back, and it's nice to see when creators feed into that.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to talk about, because there's a fine line between making characters intentionally like queer, or like in a way that will still follow the guidelines that they're
It's like ambiguous.
In the case of Gravity Falls, there's a big difference between that and like what Voltron did, where the animators and the producers went so hard and like acted like this was going to be canon, which is ultimately the downfall, because then the fandom, it ended up that it wasn't canon, and the fandom,
I feel like
got really
that's
upset.
Also just happened a lot with other fandoms, where people see, hey, these characters definitely should have ended up together, they were definitely queer, and then they end up giving them a straight partner at the end, or shipping them with someone straight. That's even happened with Star Wars, Poe and Finn. Unfortunately, Disney as well.
Yeah, and I don't know a whole much about this, but like with the whole Supernatural fandom, there's a lot of shipping there.
I can talk about that.
But they were like ridiculing fans on like panels and stuff who were bringing it up. Yeah, the producers were being assholes to their fans because they didn't support the shipping, which is insane. That's a whole opposite direction. Yeah.
Yeah, just in the Supernatural fan, I don't know any of that, like, because I actually, I didn't watch all of Supernatural, but I only watched the, like, lore relevant episodes, but I was, like, really in the fandom, and, yeah, it's, when the fandom is so, like, in love with this ship, and, like,
really rooting for it.
People will find any connection, and it really makes you think, yeah, these two characters are gay. Like, in Supernatural, the two most shipped characters, Dean and Castiel, the first time they meet, it's because Castiel, raises Dean from perdition and like saves him from hell, basically, and it's like this, and it like leaves this red scar handprint on his shoulder, and it's like these bitches are gay. I know. Yeah, so like that, and then maybe if the fandom was straight, like entirely straight, people wouldn't think that. But
it's a very gay fandom.
Yes, but yeah. So because all these queer people were attracted to Supernatural, it created that sort of opinion, dynamic. So.
Alright, so I was kind of like racking my brain on why a lot of lesbian movies, because as a lesbian, I had a phase where I wanted to watch a lot of lesbian movies, as a lesbian would, and and I was trying to figure out why they make so many lesbian movies either sad, or they make them period pieces, or both, and why there's no talking and a lot of close-ups. And so I watched this YouTube video a while back. Nyah's watched it too.
Yeah, I watched it before you.
And it talks about female gays versus male gays with lesbian movies. And yeah, I started to think about it, and it mentions in the videos how, there's specifically in this one movie, Blue is the Warmest Color, there's just a lot of close up on women's body parts, especially butts. There's a lot of that, and in something like The Handmaiden, which is another lesbian film, they focus on full body shots specifically to make them whole people instead of women just being body parts. And so I thought that was really interesting how they kind of almost seemed more boring to me because it was a lot of the movies I was watching were for the male gaze.
And, it's interesting because The Handmaiden is also a period piece since it, takes place in the early 20th century. But compared to, Blue is the Warmest Color, that's the name of the movie, right? Mm-hmm. I've not seen that one, but I know it's not a period piece. But I think it shows how you can make an effective period piece that is still, female gaze and centered around these two women without holding any space for the men. And by having kind of all the men be evil in that movie, I think it helps with that.
Yeah, I've also read articles too about I don't know if this is something they genuinely believe, but men feeling like lesbians were something just created by men for men.
Fantasy.
Yes. But it's really interesting because then it's it's fetishizing someone's identity and not allowing them to be themselves without any regard for what men or other people think.
Yeah, I was just gonna agree with you that there is a lot of straight men that think that two girls kissing is hot, and that is a really unfortunate fact of life. But it having a lesbian movie cater to that audience, is beneficial for profits or whatever.
And, adding on with that, it sucks when there are straight women who pander to that. Because there are a lot of straight women who will, they know that that's what men like, and so they'll do that to perform. And there's a lot of instances in TV shows and movies where that happens as well. So it is refreshing when there's a lesbian movie.
The entirety of the 80s, right?
Oh, yeah. Anything older than maybe the last 10 years, let's be honest.
Yeah. No, that's definitely true. And also, another thing that is very different about The Handmaiden is that throughout the entire movie, we are basically always, everything we see, every time we view one of the protagonists, it's through the other protagonist's eyes, because one of the characters is usually watching the other protagonist interact with this one awful man throughout the entire thing. So yeah, it's very cool how they actually really almost point out how a lot of lesbian movies are made for the male gaze just through the movie.
Yeah, and it's also nice to see, lesbian movies that are allowed to just be fun, that aren't, like you said, period pieces and sad or for the male gaze. And it makes me think about, But I'm a Cheerleader.
Yeah.
Who doesn't love that movie, Bottoms. I love Bottoms.
Even with other forms of media like Chapel Roan.
The movie. Yes, Chapel Roan.
No, Chapel Roan, Lil Nas X, just making it fun and not necessarily all about the struggles.
Yeah, and from personal experience being biromantic, it's the times that I've flirted with femme people and stuff have always been so much more uplifting, I feel, than with it's I feel a lot of lesbian dramas focusing on the tragedy of it all. It's there's not a lot of tragedy when you're a lesbian.
Not much now, I would say.
Yeah, but it's in terms of the relationships are, I feel they're more, they can tend to be more fulfilling in that way. There's less to draw from the drama, at least in my experience and from things I've seen.
Yeah, especially when hearing from other people in lesbian relationships, or just I'm bi, so relationships with other girls, just it can be nice. a breath of fresh air compared to being with a man. And so it's not always this super tragic silent stares and glances,
And close-ups.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you'd like to support us, you can't, but thank you anyways. Special thanks to our guest voice, British Georgette. Goodbye.